The Ukrainian soldier was already inside the enemy trench when he fired the most violent shot he had to make the enemies tremble inside their holes. The rifles of the Special Forces operators echoed among the trees that late evening. The javelins of Kiev's troops also roared as they flew off to hunt for tanks. Like victims, the Russians responded by hunting the Ukrainians with their drones, tracking them to their hideouts to fill them with fire. When they thought they were safe, there was no safety in that war. The lenses found Kiev's men walking at night. The artillery smiled at the information, preparing to detonate those new targets. It was the end of May and the battle in Kharkiv continued. The Ukrainians counterattacked, but the Russians would not give in. The entry of the Russians in the north of Kharkiv. It was an initial disaster for the Ukrainians, but by mid-May, things were already starting to change. The wave, which seemed about to engulf Kiev's unprepared forces in the region, lost strength. It crashed against a rock, and that rock, by the way, was mainly made up of forces relocated to Kharkiv. Groups like the 3rd Assault Brigade, the 36th Marine Brigade, and the 82nd Air Assault Brigade joined troops that moved into the region. The Russians continued with the 117th Guards Airborne Regiment, the 6th Combined Arms Army, and the 20th Combined Arms Army maintaining the offensive. The month of May 2024 saw many changes on both sides. Russia had been on a strong offensive since the hard push on many positions in Donetsk, which forced the Ukrainians to retreat and fear that their defensive lines would collapse. The pressure on Chasiv Yar increased tremendously. In fact, some were even saying it was about to fall to Russian control, with the Ukrainians only working to delay the enemy's advance. It was also said that Kharkiv was just a distraction to force Ukraine to deploy its fighters. However, some changes began when external support finally arrived. NATO member countries released large packages of weapons to Kiev. Many of the weapons began to arrive, allowing the Ukrainians to stabilize themselves and have hope of stopping the overwhelming Russian advance. Among the most anticipated news was the authorization to use their weapons on Russian territory, more precisely in regions that threatened Kharkiv. The arrival of new weapons packages was evident in several positions on the front. The name of the MS attacks returned to social media and the press. The MGM-140 MS attack, which stands for Army Tactical Missile System, is a short-range ballistic missile with great impact power. With a length of 4 meters, the MS attack is a compact but powerful missile. The longer-range versions can reach several thousand kilometers. This versatile system can be launched from 2 different platforms: the M270 rocket launch system, the multiple launch rocket system, and the high mobility artillery rocket system M142, the HIMARS. This flexibility allows it to be used in various terrains. The Ukrainians carried out their MS attacks at night, with the MGM targeting their objectives in May, which included an airbase in Luhansk. A massive long-range missile attack on Monday night saturated a Russian military base located far behind the front lines with cluster munitions, starting a fire visible from dozens of kilometers away. The site had been occupied by Moscow's troops, who had used the area as headquarters and a logistics base since Russia's first invasion of Ukraine in 2014. Reports indicated that an aircraft repair and maintenance facility used by Russian forces, located just a few meters from the airfield, was also targeted in the attack. These missiles even posed a challenge to one of the best air defense systems in the world, the S-400. It was a Russian long-range system, effective against aircraft, missiles, and drones, capable of detecting and destroying targets up to 400 kilometers away. Upon detecting the presence of the MS attacks, the operators activated the defenses multiple times in desperate attempts, which missed some of the incoming projectiles. The arrival came in the form of explosions and cluster munitions that detonated the entire defense system. The result was tragic for the equipment and the crew. The missiles kept being launched. The next target was the R-330ZH Zittel, a mobile electronic warfare jamming communication station mounted on a truck. The Neptune missile manufactured in Ukraine also came into action and was launched, targeting Kavkaz. The projectile traveled for miles to a violent encounter with the port, hitting the territory in yet another attack. There lies one of Russia's major sources of income. The MS attacks continued with their actions. They arrived at the Belbek airbase in Sevastopol without hesitation, making their entrance with fire. At night, satellite images obtained showed 3 Russian jets destroyed and damaged buildings. The structure of the base suffered significant damage with the possible destruction of an S-400. Although the Russian governor of Sevastopol claimed that they repelled a massive drone attack, Ukraine continued to struggle to intercept Russian missile and drone attacks. While Moscow kept up the pressure on the country's overburdened air defense systems, Kyiv called on Western allies to provide more air defense capability. But Russia has also changed its tactics to make it harder for Ukraine to intercept weapons, including launching larger barrages. A report stated that Ukraine's air defense network was slowly deteriorating and Kyiv was facing ammunition shortages. Ukraine intercepted only 46% of Russian missiles in the past 6 months, compared to 73% in the previous 6 months. Russian President Vladimir Putin publicly expressed Moscow's outrage at some NATO allies' approval of Ukraine to use Western weapons more broadly, both to defend its borders and to strike selected targets inside Russia. Thus, the war in Ukraine was expanding, and Russia would show its fury over these events by attacking Kharkiv with even more force. Fire rained down on Vovchansk, with Russian shelling retaliating for all the Ukrainian attacks and bold moves at the beginning of the month. The city, just like Lipsy, became one of the main focal points of the fighting in Kharkiv in the 2 most recent fronts of the war. The bombs dropped shattered the structures of buildings in different parts of the urban area. The Russians wanted to eliminate the Ukrainian hideouts. When they saw the men walking up to their hideouts to rest, they activated the kamikaze drones to deliver a loud and fiery wake-up call to the troubled sleep of the soldiers from Kyiv. The nighttime attacks captured the glowing shapes of the Ukrainians sweating as they moved between the trees to reach their new positions. Death descended upon them, embracing them with explosions that made their pale shapes disappear from the Russian screens. The job of stopping the Russian offensive was dangerous for any group. The troops of the Ukrainian multiple launch rocket system Grad were ordered to a new firing position where they were to target the Russians who attempted a new advance. They didn't know they had already been detected by the observation drone. The Lancet Izdeli 53 carried 5 kg of explosives. What a massive explosion! As they greeted the munitions from the crate, the Russian squads advanced into Ukrainian positions in small groups, moving on foot and observing the art of war displayed in the form of sculptures of metal twisted by fire and corpses rotting in the open air. The entire trail of combat was scattered along the paths in northern Kharkiv. It was for these men walking that the Ukrainian snipers were waiting. Sometimes it was days of lying in wait, waiting for the moment when the Russians' heads would appear among the trees. The rifle aimed and fired at the figures who tried to advance, taking down men and scattering squads. The assault groups weren't always surprised by the snipers' heavy ammunition. Filmed by the aerial plague, which was a hallmark of the war, they moved among the ruins until they rested. During the night, the Predator took advantage of the moment to dive in with its fiery claws, which tore apart the men sent by Putin. The nighttime blasts were even more terrifying. The drones were barely visible. Only the cursed buzzing spread through the air, followed by explosions over any of the soldiers. The terror of the darkness fell silent, and the sun once again shone on men who would not awaken from their nightmares. The Russians tried to use ingenuity and different resources to resupply their forward positions. Vans adapted with electronic jamming equipment made their way. The signal jamming was not enough to stop the blow the vehicle took from a kamikaze drone. The driver hurried out, but any unconscious man inside the van as well as its supplies were consumed by the fire. The use of these vehicles was quick and cheap since the drones were destroying everything, no matter how armored it was, if it weren't for those damn drones. The Ukrainians were still waiting in the ruins, with their javelins aimed, one of the weapons that became famous in the war for having destroyed so many Russian armored vehicles. It was good to remember that this equipment caused a lot of damage in Kharkiv. Their shots flew across the oblast at various points during the beginning of the Russian invasion in 2022 and later, when they were expelled from the region. Many of the Kremlin's tank carcasses in the fields of Kharkiv were the result of the Javelin's handiwork. The Kremlin did not stop sending reinforcements from Belgorod. Their equipment was transported by train to keep the Kharkiv offensive going. With the traditional goal of bombing everything in sight, the Russians made sure to attack the nearest Ukrainian radars so their planes wouldn't be disturbed. Enemy access was cut off by bombing bridges over the Vovchansk River near the village of Volokivka. The high-explosive aerial bombs in their various weights, whether 500 kilograms or even up to 1.5 tons, glided and played their role in carving out the destruction of anything that was still standing. In Vovchansk, all that weight with a very high explosive charge was dropped from above by fighter jets at a distance of 60 to 70 kilometers. Out of range of many available Ukrainian air defenses. At that moment, the smoke rose in the city only after it started to disperse. The Russian destruction revealed itself in all its violence. Civilian bodies were scattered, their lives taken by enemy weapons. They were left lying in the open with only the surrounding fire as their funeral ritual, sending up smoke that marked the disaster over Vovchansk. A police car that was trying to evacuate the wounded was caught in the middle of the attacks, separating more souls from their bodies. So many bombs didn't just cause damage to military targets. The Russians claimed there were Ukrainian munitions in a hypermarket and sent their FABs on Saturday, the busiest day, shocking people with the violence of the strikes. There were more than 200 civilians in the establishment. When the fire started to spread, the column of smoke marked that the target had been hit perfectly. It was dense and fueled by the flames that kept spreading. The fire consumed the structure. While the firefighters tried to stop the damage and save anyone still trapped in the rubble, bodies were left on the ground. Little was left of the attacked supermarket except for the mark of what war brought to humanity. Of course, this led to an exchange of accusations, including the Russians later saying that the attacks had killed 25 civilians. In Luhansk, a bomb fell in downtown Kharkiv during one of the attacks. The strikes raised the number of civilians killed in the city to 16 still in May. Since the beginning of this new offensive, the soldiers have kept fighting in the middle of this madness. The 42nd Brigade of the Ukrainians took their striker to advance against the Russians in Vovchansk. The fighting filled the streets with smoke. The chaos of combat was intensified by the .50 machine gun and the war cries of the soldiers as they came out of the hatch to launch RPGs at the enemies. Explosions, fire, and chaos became the elements that defined Vovchansk. The striker pulled back after completing its mission, but the fighting inside the city continued. The forces of the Russian Volunteer Corps were one of the groups that accompanied the Ukrainians in the fighting in Kharkiv. Their soldiers were inside the houses of Vovchansk, using them to work against those with whom they shared a nation at birth, but not the same feelings for their leader. The machine guns showed no regard for Russian lives, firing plenty of ammunition into the air to clear the way for others to leave the house. The soldiers fired even more shots from their AKs, suppressing the targets, while one of them went around to launch the rocket-propelled grenade. The Russians tried to contain these Ukrainian advances, with even more bombs falling on the buildings and houses. The Volkhya River was a point to be crossed during the advance of Kiev's forces, with the bridges destroyed. They tried to use floating bridges, but the Russians found out about them, targeted the locations, and launched their attacks. This kind of crossing was too important a target that the Russian bombs didn't miss. The Ukrainian equipment was hit by drones, and when the crew was lucky, they were still able to save their lives to fight later in new machines. The precision with which the bombs flew toward the tree lines where the Ukrainians had built their trenches was such that they fell one after another, an almost perfect line of death being distributed. The Ukrainians tried to advance with the American M113 vehicle, but it was spotted by the Russian drone. The grenades that tormented it made the crew leave the area, but the drone kept working until it put the vehicle out of action. The Russians made even more of their innovations on the battlefield, increasing the number of soldiers moving on motorcycles with improvised protections against drones. These were supposed to be fast and agile transports, easy to stop in wooded areas. Those who took the risk on these motorcycles were brave. There was no protection that was completely effective against a drone attack, let alone against a soldier's gunfire. A pair who tried to use this method was ambushed by Ukrainian drones with so many shots that not even the vehicle remained intact. The 3rd Regiment of the Ukrainian Special Forces started a fight by firing an AT-4 at the hole where the opponents were hiding. The rifle rose in the operator's hands and the rounds passed through the suppressors. In the deadly flights toward the Russians, the first line of defense of the Kremlin's soldiers heard the Ukrainians' threats and demands for surrender. 3 of them gave in, coming out with their hands raised. Those who didn't accept heard more NATO standard rifle rounds unleashing pieces of death. The Special Forces operators moved through the trees, keeping their deadly rate of fire, and Russian bodies kept falling, filled with those evil gifts. In the body, another holdout was found, received grenades to reshape the space and reduce the number of casualties. The attack ended with 11 Russians killed and 3 captured. The Russian Lancets were a weapon that proliferated in Kharkiv. Their swarms targeted Ukrainian equipment with fireballs. Tanks and other armored vehicles were hit, even when hidden among the trees. And multiple launch rocket system Grad tried to escape the pests, desperately driving down the road until it was hit in the rear. The multiple launch rocket system driver fled, knowing that the ammunition could detonate if attacked. The explosions caused by the Russians were part of the Ukrainian soldiers' existence on the front line. The abundance of shells raining down from the sky made every soldier tense about what could hit them. The fighter lived through this, trying to take lives or save them. One of them used an SUV to cross a territory where Russia was setting everything on fire, hoping to harvest Ukrainian corpses. The vehicle sped through the Valley of Death. Seeing the explosions falling nearby, the driver felt the vibrations reaching his body. The notion of the fragility of his existence flashed through his mind, but he shook off the distraction to stay focused amid the chaos. The men brought the wounded man to him and put him in the car. The Russians tried to adjust the artillery as they watched the enemy. They left through the smoke, leaving the dust behind, leaving a part of themselves behind. Broken by the trauma of seeing death and smelling it in the smoke. These efforts managed to level the disputes between Russians and Ukrainians. In Vovchansk, the initiative lost by the Kremlin gave more and more strength to Kiev. Yassiv Yar, which was supposed to be the reason for the distraction in Kharkiv, still hadn't fallen in May, even though many still claimed it was just a matter of time. This by no means meant that the situation became calm. The Russians were there, Vovchansk was destroyed. An investigative focus of the State Bureau of Investigation of Ukraine was directed at the reasons for the failure in organizing the defense of positions on the border of Kharkiv Oblast.
The investigation analyzed the problems.
Command of the 125th Territorial Defense Brigade, the 23rd Mechanized Brigade, and the 123rd Territorial Defense Forces Brigade, as well as other involved units. The defensive failure of these troops enabled the Russian advance. Russian sources observed that the front line stalled inside Vovchansk at the end of May, and one of them stated that Russian forces were unable to cross the Vovcha River during a reconnaissance operation in western Vovchansk. A Russian propagandist also reported that Ukrainian formations gathered more than 50 battalions which were being withdrawn from all fronts, leaving other points of the front unguarded and also bringing strategic reserves to Kharkiv. Up until that specific moment at the end of May 2024, all that Russia had achieved in Kharkiv was a brief advance that was halted by Ukrainian forces. This meant more lives lost, more houses destroyed, and there were also many casualties and men captured among the Ukrainians. The columns of smoke rising in Ukraine streaked across the sky, signaling to the world that no politician was yet satisfied with the number of deaths and sacrifices made by their men and women. They would only stop burning through so many lives when there were enough enemy relatives mourning their dead soldiers, or when the blood of their subjects was so much that it made them slip from their thrones.